Hello and welcome to Insight. Today we have with us Mr. Mmhonlumo Kikon. Mr. Kikon is the national spokesperson of the Bharatiya Janata Party. He is an advisor to the government of Nagaland as well as a two-time MLA from Nagaland. Apart from his many accomplishments, he has also published 3 books on poetry. Join us as we get an insider's view today on the various aspects of Naga politics, society, as well as the longest running insurgency in Bharat. Mr. Kikon, it's such a pleasure to have you with us on Insight today, and that too in this lovely city, Guwahati. Thank you for joining us.
It's actually my pleasure, and thank you for having me at Insight today. I mean, it's an honor as well and a privilege for somebody from my region to be part of your popular show.
Not at all, Northeast is a favorite of ours.
Yes.
But having said that, Mr. Kikon, without much ado, I'd like to ask you about your state, Nagaland. Nagaland represents so many tribes. I believe there are over 16 tribes and many, many sub-tribes. Could you explain to us how the word Naga then came into being, considering you have so many different tribes?
As you mentioned, there are 16 tribes in Nagaland state, but out of that, only 14 are Naga tribes. 2 are Kukis and Kacharis. But you yourself are an anthropologist, you would know that the Nagas live outside of Nagaland as well. There is a sizable population in Manipur, in Assam, and also in Arunachal and the northwest of Sagaing division in Myanmar. So there are Nagas in all parts. We live in a contiguous area. Divided now into different geographical boundaries.
Correct.
So the affinity, the cultural association over the years have become much more stronger.
Even though you had separate languages, there wasn't a cohesive script that all the tribes used. Were the religious practices also different amongst all the tribes?
The genesis is something like this. Even among same tribes, during the head hunting days, villages used to fight against the other village, even if you are from the same tribe. So over time, after British came and the colonization happened, a lot of that was contained and controlled. And after Christian missionaries came, I mean, there was a concerted attempt to do away with head hunting practices. So generally it was done away with, although we have incidences as recent as 1990, which was covered in the BBC in the state of Nagaland itself. So different tribes have different languages, but according to many linguists, the etymological roots of many of the Naga languages can be derived. I mean, they say it's derived from the same etymological roots, and in fact, the conception of the worldview in terms of the languages used and the meanings is derived from that. And to add to further to in response to your question, to add to my response, these tribes, there are plenty of tribes. And the religion we practiced before the advent of Christianity was loosely termed as animism. As you rightly pointed out, religious practices were similar across the Naga tribes, and also in terms of head hunting and other the social fabric and the structure were similar. You will have a boys' hostel which also doubled up as a training center for boys in the villages. And those days activities were limited to agriculture, hunting, and also head hunting. So all survival skills were taught in that training center. So every tribe has a name for that. So for instance, I belong to the Lotha community. We call it Chumpo. But generally that hostel or the training center is now known by another Naga tribe's definition called Morung.
Yeah.
So you will have that in every tribe. So like I was saying, anthropologists have identified certain cultural practices and traits which define the notion of the word Naga, and the acceptance of it as our identity and the name that we want to go by is now there is no discussion on that now, because it's assumed that this is our identity. So over the years, through various political administrators who doubled up as the ethnographers.
Yes.
Then you have after that the Christian missionaries who translated, or because we all come from the oral tradition, who literally use the Roman the sort of
Roman script?
The Roman script, yeah. Sorry, how can it be so difficult? So they use the Roman script to write down the alphabets.
Yes.
Of every tribe, and that's how the transition from oral tradition to the written word happened. And this was mostly by the missionaries. So the first education actually happened at the hands of the missionaries.
So I have happened to have read Mary Clark's diary, and it clearly shows how difficult it was to break into these communities, how long it took to be able to translate their language onto a script and then teach them that script. Nagas clearly are and have been fierce warrior tribes. There have been enough historical references to this from the times of the Ahams, even when the British came in. How did it then become maybe easy or possible for the Christian missionaries to break into the religious fabric of these tribes?
First of all, you're aware that the British colonial leaders or the administrator at that point of time decided that it is better for the missionaries to come and educate the Nagas and also other tribes around Northeast. There was a generally accepted policy of ensuring that one denomination is sent to common people. I mean, one tribe. For instance, for the Nagas, we had the American Baptist missionaries who came, and like you rightly mentioned, Mary Mead Clark is from America. She's an American Baptist, and then the Presbyterians were sent to Mizoram for the Mizos. And there were two reasons for that. One is in their language, which is now being critiqued and challenged, is true responses from our own scholars. They wanted to civilize the savaged, because in their conception we were wild, we were headhunters, and it also meant to imply that we were unreasonable and we liked fighting and all that. So those days the raids by the Naga villages in the plains of Assam was something which affected the British policy of getting revenue and also plundering the natural resources, and also they had tea plantations, oil exploration already started in Dikboy. So it was around the time that they decided to allow missionaries to come and work with the various tribes. There was one particular point which I find very interesting, that they had to come all the way from America, and that time they didn't have planes nor trains. So imagine the journey they must have taken. It must have taken them, according to records, at least 2-3 months to reach here, this part, West Bengal, Kolkata, from that side. So and then by steamer they come, and they came, and I think they were driven to evangelize the Nagas, and they first came to Mokchung district, but they also were able to penetrate because they were helped and assisted by a local Assamese missionary, Godhula. Yeah, so it was not them alone. And in fact, if you read my latest book of poems, I have mentioned about Mary Mead Clark.
What is the book
In
called?
my book is called Sling Stones. It has biblical reference in terms of the word sling stones, but I have a poem titled Missionaries. So if you read that, you would find reference to Mary Mead Clark. So the most common picture or photo of Mary Mead Clark is that we find now in all those literature is of her being carried in a bamboo, in a woven basket. So it must have been difficult for them, but they were being carried by, so there must have been a collusion between the British administrator and the missionaries. Otherwise, they would not get that kind of, assistance those days. So to go to any place and to, proclaim a new religion is not easy. And this applies to every religion. So at that point of time, it must have been very difficult for them. We recognize that, and but once it grew, it's just spread. And I'll tell you the story of a guy called Shanjamo Chungi. He is from my tribe, so he was also one of the first Christians from my tribe. So he was baptized by Reverend Clark, and he was sent to the US to complete his studies. So he was the first Naga to go to the US, and thereafter, of course, in the First World War, a lot of our Naga people were sent as porters to France and all that. So yeah, interaction with the British colonialists, then the missionaries, then exposure in Europe during the First World War and then the Second World War as well. So these are the interactions we've had. But coming back to your question, the missionaries had a tough time, but they were coming in droves. They were coming in separate batches as well. From Mokchung, they came to Wokha, then it was Kohima, and then in Manipur, in Ukhrul. So the batches of missionaries that came with, usually when missionaries come, they come with the typewriter. They come also, in fact, in order to survive, if you go to the mission center in Mokchung, where Reverend Clark had started the missionary center, you would find the tools that they brought. They were hoes. So they were there, and in order to eat, they had also to farm. And Nagas, by the way, at least the majority of the Nagas practice shifting cultivation. We call it Jum cultivation. So for them, it was a new kind of cultivation. And of course, there is some one or two tribes who practice terrace cultivation. That's another technology in terms in the farming system. So it is practiced by Angamis and some other tribes, but mostly the Nagas practice Jum cultivation. So they also brought in hoes, and the most important thing they brought was the typewriter, so that they could translate the Bible in the tribe's language. So while doing that, they sort of wrote the dictionary for the different tribes, in the Roman script, and that's how the entire transition from oral to the written word started.
That's fantastic. But to add to what you were saying about the British policies, that this must have had to have the backing of British policies. Of course, you would know this, but I would mention this for the benefit of our viewers, is the Charter Act of 1813, which specifically said exactly what you pointed out, that it is our moral obligation to civilize savages, and this was not just limited to the northeastern tribes, but to the rest of India as well. And later on, I believe it was also the Commissioner of Assam, David Scott, who wrote a letter to the Secretary of the government of Great Britain, asking him for funds to be sent to back the missionaries. So you're quite right. But having said that, the British policy also brought in the inner line regulation, which is, one of the still long-standing legacies of the British in the Northeast. At that point, from what I understand, it was to contain these tribes so that they do not disturb their trade routes. In today's date, do you think that this has become something that has alienated these tribes, not just in Nagaland but in other states as well, to the rest of India, or has it protected them?
There are many theories to that particular policy, and also you have rightly pointed out the regulations, but many historians today of colonial, the history that we have in the region have pointed out very clearly the reasons behind why these policies were enacted. Number one, you should be very clear that the British had only one agenda: revenue and resource exploitation. So if you look at their land revenue policies, it was just to ensure that they get revenue out of the land that people use, the farmers or the population uses, and the resources, as you well know, tea and oil were the major resources they were after. There were other items as well, but this drove their policy towards this region. They were not really interested in entering Naga Hills or Lucia Hills, but because of the constant raids on their economic protectorates, some of the activities were like they had tea gardens and all that. So mainly to stop the raids, they came up with various policies. One was the inner line regulation. So they divided the nearer hills and villages in the hills near the valleys as excluded area. The further off towards Burma, they put it as partially, this was the partially excluded, that further off was the excluded area. So if you look at the very, reason why they came up with such policy is that they use words like they didn't want others to exploit and interfere in the governance systems of the village and all that, village republics as they call it. But as you have rightly pointed out, it was mainly to ensure that they don't come and disturb their economic activities, their resource exploitation, areas where they do all this extraction. Now, in fact, when political administrative headquarters were made in the Lucia Hills, in the Naga Hills and all that, it was made mainly so that they are brought under the British administration. The constant raids are contained, and in order to use the civilize the savage, as they call it, they brought in the missionaries so that schools come and are run by these people. So historians today of that colonial period, especially the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, you will find that it was to contain the raids that led to a whole lot of that policy. As to the question that you asked in the last part of your question, many of the colonial policies have been re-enacted post-independence to address similar problems. So I would say that right after 1947, when India got independence, most of the policies were continued, and even after the drafting of the constitution, there are areas where similar policies of exclusion or maybe in the name of preservation, the inner line permit still continues. So there is a whole debate over it, which will take a lot of time to explain, but I feel that today there is a review of that policy. In Nagaland, we have something called the registration of indigenous inhabitants of Nagaland. So this is a policy which is being discussed, and the government of Nagaland actively consults all the civil societies for such policies which are going to impact them. So this is something which would enable the government to register every citizens, and also ensure that we are able to come up with a policy where non-Nagas who are residents also get the opportunity to do business, and to ensure that their contribution is legalized.
To make it more inclusive.
Yeah, to make it more inclusive, and we have to accept the reality that it's not only the Nagas who live in Nagaland now. As part of India, so many other communities come for government jobs, for business, for as laborers, and also neighboring states, citizens of neighboring states come. So all Indian citizens should be eligible at certain levels to be part of the state of Nagaland. So this is a slightly forward policy as a follow-up of the ILP.
That's fantastic to hear.
Yeah.
But having said that, how does the youth view becoming a part of the mainstream? Because there has been this discussion that, and of course with the insurgency in Nagaland, that there is this feeling of a separate identity to the national consciousness. Today, has that view changed amongst the youth?
I will address it a little differently by referring to 3-4 instances or events, or in fact processes that have taken place over the years. 1997, when the ceasefire was signed with the NSC and I, there was a transition from intense conflict to a semblance of peace because of the absence of that conflict. And for a very long time now, we have witnessed at least regular frisking, regular fighting and all that. As a young student, I have faced and gone through that phase. So I feel that today times have changed. Today everybody from the young to the old believes that dialogue is the way. And that being the fact, we know that the government of India and the various parties, Naga political group as you call them, are having negotiation. So a lot of people who were born in 97 now, they are 24 years old. They don't have any idea of what the conflict was like.
Correct.
So if you look and talk to them, all these teenagers and young people, they will not remember that time. But they have a sense of an identity which they take pride in, whether it is your tribal identity or the common Naga identity. However, Nagas, the young Nagas know that we cannot live in isolation, and they are looking forward to a solution through this peace process, so that things will change, so that business and entrepreneurship environment will have an ecosystem which works for them. And that is the hope they have in the present negotiations, that the solution will bring about that kind of change. Gainful employment, opportunities in business sector, and because as you know that Nagaland is the only state, Nagaland is a state, as a state, Nagaland has the highest number of government servant per capita, per population. So that thing should change, and to because also it boils down to the question of security and the insecurity of the citizens. Any business establishment will be affected by the conflict, and therefore people's participation in entrepreneurship and all that actually is lesser, and it is out of fear. because there is an atmosphere of uncertainty. However, if you are in the government job, you feel that you will get salary even if there is conflict or not. So there is that sense of security. So that persists today. The story I wanted to tell you is about a friend of mine who was a very active student leader, and he was my senior actually in college, and he was like any one of us, Naga youth, having dreams of becoming a doctor or an engineer, you know, studying in science college, but he instead joined the Indian Army. And for a Naga youth to join the Indian Army, it takes a lot of courage, and also that is an aspiration which not many people had at that point of time, but today we will see many joining. At that point of time, he was one of the few who joined as a captain, and he is awarded the second highest bravery award in the country because of the fact that he gave his life during the Kargil war. So I remember as a college student then, when his body was brought back home by the army, and he died fighting the Pakistani soldiers in the Kargil war in the Dras sector, and he was valorized by one and all in the entire country. But he was also received as a hero in Nagaland state. So that time I thought, you know, that any sacrifice that a Naga youth makes, whether it is for the Naga issue or for the Indian state, people identify with the sacrifice. So if you look at that particular incident, and now is honored respectfully by both the country and also the state of Nagaland, and he is a role model for many. Whereas before, we, because of the conflict, were looked at as rebels by everywhere in India. He demonstrated that once people who were called rebel became the defender of the country in the Kargil war, and he gave his life for that, and he gave his life for the country. So that sort of changed, you know, the notion. So you will have divided opinions in the state among the Nagas as well, but there are instances like that which has changed and shaped opinions. Our youths want to grow up like any other youths in the country, without any conflict, without any issue. But then you would easily identify when our youths are outside of the state, in other states, there are, you know, issues of having, you know, local issues with the other, you know, people belonging to other states, and takes time for different communities to adjust to each other. However, they aspire to reap the benefit of, you know, the new India. And I feel the more and more I discuss with the young people of my state, they are raring to go. They are looking for opportunities, and they want both the government and also the private sector to create that opportunity for them. And I was privileged to hold a portfolio of skill development in my last term, and I saw that thousands of youths were willing to go get trained and work in a private sector if placement is given to them. And I feel that out of 100%, at least 50-60% are doing well and growing in their own respective jobs as well. So I think that there is no one general opinion about the perception of the youths of Nagaland, but I have given you a mirror into how different people think differently, and how the kind of role models that they look up to shape their interests as well. But generally it boils down to having gainful employment, getting the respect from you know, your society. That is very important. There are two people from my community who are actively playing in national football teams outside of the, you know, district and the state. And if I look at their profession, they are earning much more than they would be if they were in government jobs. but they're also enjoying the sports. So right now the government is providing a lot of support to sportsmen and creating infrastructure, and we also want to be the sports power hub of India, Nagaland state. So in the future we expect our youths to perform and to play in national teams and clubs and all that, so that they will earn for themselves, they will have a good life, and also they'll come back and start something new. We are going ahead. I was sharing with you that in my life I have never seen a 4-lane in the state of Nagaland. But after our Prime Minister came to power in 2014, now we have at least 3 4 lanes. The other 4 lanes are being constructed. So a lot of highways are being constructed in the state of Nagaland.
And I can be witness to that.
You can be witness to that.
Because I've traveled there many a times and infrastructure was an issue.
Yeah. The development priority of the center in the past, in spite of the creation of donor by Vajpayee ji, did not really looked at the various development criteria that are there. So in the past it was random. Whoever had that political capital, whichever state had that heft in politics, would get the projects, and states like Nagaland will be left out, because since 2003 Nagaland has been with the NDA. So for the 10 years that UPA was in power, we were very neglected. So it's a fact. I mean, statistics point to attest to that statement I made. But you see, the development that we have seen has really made people think about what can be done, what are their possibilities, what are their potential. We talk about tourism. We have the famous Hornbill Festival in Nagaland. Now that roads are getting better, infrastructure is coming, so we hope that whereas we were attracting say 2-3 lakhs tourists, we hope that we will attract more than that. And thanks to the Herculean effort by the government and also the support by central government, we were able to manage the COVID cases, and vaccination is at a higher rate. So we are also in a way working like never before. The state is gearing up to respond to the challenges put not by just by its citizens, but also the visions that we have shared during our election campaigns. So this is something new that we have not seen. So there is a churn, there is enthusiasm among the citizens today.
Correct. Do you think that this enthusiasm might be a little premature, considering that the agreement with the Naga groups hasn't come to a fruition as yet?
Any issue like that will take some time. That we all understand. You will see the difference between, let's say, a Jawaharlal Nehru and a Narendra Modi. When Jawaharlal Nehru was Prime Minister of this country for so many years, he ignored the issue. He sort of used force to tackle the issue. And when Western countries were criticizing him of using force, he was very arrogant and replied in the negative. So losing a lot of face for the country. Come 2015, Prime Minister, after just 1 year of his position as the Prime Minister, after assuming office, signed the framework agreement with the NSC and IM. So that was a very positive step. And since then, there has been a very concerted and consistent attempt to engage in a dialogue which will arrive at a meaningful solution. And I believe that it has taken time, but that time that they took has actually reaped some benefits. And today, even as we discuss here, Government of India is leaving no stone unturned in continuing with the discussion. There is, the talks are going on almost every day in Delhi. So there is a very clear, prioritized attempt by the Prime Minister to have this issue solved, and that is happening today. So we expect that all contentious issue will be trashed out, and we expect that some solution should come about at the earliest. We are praying for that, and I hope that once that is on the table, we will be able to go ahead with new vision and new enthusiasm.
Absolutely, we all hope to see this come to a conclusion really soon, and I think the way we have seen the government move and make it such a priority, it isn't too long before this happens. But just going a little back in history again, at the onset of this insurgency, when the disturbances started, there has been some sort of discussion and debate on the role of the missionaries within the insurgency. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Since you said let's go back till the time when Warrior Elwin was the advisor of Nehru. So it was him actually who pointed out to Nehru that it was the missionaries who have been advising that time the Naga National Council on taking stringent positions, and also helping them in whatever activities the NNC carried out. And people today think that it is the present government who has come up with that kind of accusation, or even Vajpayee government. But this was already there during Nehru's time. Warrior Elwin had advised him that we should restrict the Christian missionaries because they are misguiding the Nagas. So he and his bureaucrats at that point of time actually were responsible for insulting the pride of the Nagas, and also for dragging the issue too long at that point of time, whereas he could have actually solved it. And there are many analysts who points towards that kind of conclusion. But to say that missionaries had misguided the Nagas and all would be, I think not really factual. There were instances at that point of time when Nehru said after giving statehood to Nagaland. Anyway, before he died, the peace mission which was proposed was supposed to include Reverend Michael Scott,
yes,
a missionary.
Yes.
So who was there interested in the peace process because of Piso at that time, and Piso had convinced him through his nephew. Now, the whole time this fellow was involved, Reverend Michael Scott was involved. He was involved with the intention of helping the Nagas achieve whatever they could within that, the moment where, that time, if you remember, 9-point agreement was also something they alluded to, or they were pursuing. Even Piso had agreed to that in some of the historical records that we read. However, because of the creation of state of Nagaland, Piso was not happy, and the next round of talks, which Nehru also agreed before he died, was started in 1964. So from then till now, there has been two negotiations. One is that, the second is the 1997 one, which are significant. I would not call 1975, the Shillong Accord, which was signed during the emergency by Indira Gandhi, as significant. So today, Nagas have moved away from that hand-holding by the missionaries at that time, who were packed off after the country got independence to their respective country. So we only had the local missionaries who were also Nagas, and this movement was beyond them. This movement was not influenced by them. So it had a life of its own. And this is, I am stating from what is there historically. It's not my opinion even, but to say that the missionaries had impacted or is still impacting is a wrong notion. I would say that because of the work of the American Baptists, the Baptists in Nagaland are, a member of the World Baptist Alliance. So they may have their network, but it's not for this purpose. That is for their religious purposes that alliance exists. So I would say that today, no. That was a reflection of what Very Elwin told Nehru, and at that point missionaries were expelled, and today that issue is no longer there. That case does not arise now.
So finally, the issue of Naga insurgency not only affects Nagaland but also affects the rest of the states in the northeast. So this agreement that we are talking about, would it solve all the problems that the other states face as well?
Right now, at this stage where the discussions are on, and from what we hear in the media and through, I'm part of the Parliamentary Core Committee, so through our interactions with the various agencies, both from the government, also from the what we call the undergrounds, the NSCN. Most of the issues which were opposed to by different states have been addressed and discussed. And I think the solution that the Prime Minister is alluding to or looking forward to will be inclusive. So a solution which is definitely, which provokes or which has the reaction from other communities, other states, will also create more problem. So any solution should be within the framework and the concept of coexistence, peaceful coexistence, and also which supports the future of the Naga youths. So I think that aspect has been tricky. It has been there. I acknowledge the existence. And take for instance the 2001 proclamation by L.K. Advani as the Home Minister of India, that the ceasefire will be without territorial limits. It created a lot of issues. However, the fact remains that the Naga issue now is no longer looked in isolation. It is looked at with the eyes of coexistence, and from the perspective of sharing rights. I think that has been clearly mentioned in the framework agreement as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So, Mr. Kikon, thank you so much for delving deep into the issues that plague Nagaland. But you've shown us hope that there is a solution that is in the offing, and we pray and hope that it comes to a conclusion really soon.
Thank you for having me. I'm an eternal optimist, and in fact I believe that the dialogues going in the right direction today is giving us a lot of hope. And I've already stated what hope means to the Naga youths.
Absolutely.
So this is the key to creating that ecosystem which is supported by peace, which is supported by all the agencies or the individuals involved, or the people involved, and this will ensure that all-round development will come to not just Nagaland but the entire Northeast.
Correct.
Yeah.
So we have our faith in the Naga people and the government of India.
Yes.
And your party, and we hope to hear the good news very soon.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for being on it. Nagaland is clearly entering a new phase, from insurgency to peace, now with the Naga agreement expected to come to a sensible conclusion very soon. The state has geographically always been a part of Bharat, but without divisive forces and with a new focus on development, it is soon going to hold a place of pride in our collective consciousness. Insight.
Thank you for having me.